Now, we've started the Romantic period in France. We saw this with the transition from Jacques-Louis David to his students like Ingres. We're going to continue to look at the Romantic period in France for a bit, and then we're going to move out of France and look at the Romantic period elsewhere in Europe. But it makes sense to start in France because we see the transition so clearly in Jacques-Louis David and his students in France. Our next artist is not a direct student of Jacques-Louis David, but his teacher was a student of Jacques-Louis David. So we're seeing this lineage. And unlike the neoclassic, this is an extremely horrific and unimaginable scene in front of us. What we have is Gericault's Raft of the Medusa. Now, the Raft of the Medusa is depicting a real event that happened in 1816. So we're looking here, the Raft of the Medusa is the title, and Gericault painted it between 1818 and 1819. But the event that he's depicting happened in 1816. What happened was that there was a merchant marine ship called the Medusa, and it had set sail from France to travel down to the French colonies along the West African coast. The ship was captained by an incompetent man. This man had been appointed captain of the Medusa because he was friends with the king. The king of France hired his friend to captain the Medusa. Because of his incompetency, he had never piloted a ship of this size. The ship ran aground a shallow reef, and it splintered, and it just completely bursted to bits. There were 150 survivors from the shipwreck. Now, the captain and his high-ranking officials grabbed the 2 lifeboats, and the rest of the survivors had to scramble together, and they made a raft from the rubble of the Medusa that was floating on the surface of the water. So calling this the Raft of the Medusa is because this is the raft made from the scraps of the ship Medusa that had splintered on the reef. The raft was filled with over 150 survivors. After several days, the captain and his officers cut the raft loose from their lifeboats, and they were like, I don't think anybody's coming, so we got to get out of here. And they left the people on this raft. They were adrift for 12 days, and in that 12-day period, the survivors dwindled from 150 to just 15 survivors. Now, the survivors were rescued and interviewed, and it became an international news story. And their stories of their time on the raft were read in newspapers all over the world. People described their time on the raft as one of murder. There was traitors. There were dead bodies that were floating on the water, and others who had died from their injuries from the initial shipwreck. Here, Gericault, who was fascinated by this news story, he tries to recreate the moment in which they were rescued. So we see the survivors, and we see them reaching up. Oh, I will also tell you that when they first assembled the raft, they gathered a few barrels of spoiled water and rotten food. So those are the barrels there. The moment that Gericault is depicted is the moment of their rescue after the 12 days adrift. So you see them raising up, trying to signal a boat. Where's this boat? It's this ship way out in the distance. There. It's so far and it's so tiny, it seems hopeless that they'll be found, that they'll be rescued. At any moment, one of these giant waves, these crests, could obscure them and they'll never be found. So here we see this beautiful, and I say beautiful because look at the bodies. They're full of muscle and they're majestic in their postures, and they're using the last of their strength to rise up because they want to live, they want to survive. At the same time, we see the rotting, bloating corpses stuck in the raft, bobbing in the water. Ooh. Here, the Medusa ship, this is a drawing of it. It was originally a 40-gun frigate that had launched as a warship under Napoleon I, under Emperor Napoleon. However, by 1816, it had been reduced to a transport vessel for admirals and traveled to and from the French African colonies. So here we are looking at a map of the colonies, the European colonization of Africa, which, by the way, is a completely different subject. And if you want to know more about the 18th century colonization of Africa, email me and I can give you more information. But France's colonies down here, do I have it? They were traveling to the port of Saint Louis in Senegal. Senegal, it's just around here, I believe it's on this side or is it on this side? But they were supposed to just round this corner. But this is a very treacherous area of the African coast. And here, Gericault is depicting not the moment of the split, not the moment that they scramble together, but instead the moment of their rescue. He was fascinated by the story to the point where he made a life-size version of the raft in his studio. He was reading the books and the articles published by published about the stories of the survivors, and from that he assembled this raft. And this is a drawing. You can see how he's trying to work out his composition of how he wants to angle the people and the elements of the raft. Why would he want to paint this? And why are we seeing such a moment of heroism as they strike up to be saved? At the same moment, we see this horrific death. This is your next vocabulary term, the sublime. The sublime is this feeling of awe mixed with terror. You're overwhelmed by the vastness and the obscurity of humanity, but there's also this beauty in it. So you have this horrific understanding of death, but that just makes life more sweeter. Does that make sense? This increased interest in the sublime, and I give it a title, or I give it a capitals, the sublime, is because during the Romantic period, it's not just a time in art and architecture, but this is also a time referred to as the Romantic period in literature and in music. In terms of music, Beethoven is seen as a Romantic composer. And the idea of the sublime is something that we see in literature at this time as well, this pain and fear and this intense emotion that causes these kind of thrilling emotions or feelings in your body. Look at this. This is the actual size of the painting. It's huge. It's at the Louvre Museum, and I love this image here because it helps us understand how overwhelming the figures are. They are so big, and if we stand in front of it, they are life size, over life size. And if we were to stand in front of the painting, where are we? Come on, we did this with Napoleon and the coronation of Napoleon, right? Where are we standing? Are we on the raft? Uh-oh, no, we're not. We're in the water. We are the dead. We're the ones floating away. We are not the ones who are being rescued. Now you can see most of the people are lifting up, rising up for this hope of survival. And yet look at this man over here. This gray-haired man clutches onto the swollen, rotting body of a younger man. What we have here is a young man, perhaps a man and his son, and they had traveled on the Medusa together, and his son died. And look at this face, it's blank. For him, there is no hope. There is no future. His future is dead and is in his arms. Gericault is very intentionally trying to emphasize this father and son. Here's a sketch. He wants us to see the other side of the rescue. He wants us to feel the despair, the loss, the pain. He wanted us to experience it with extreme accuracy. Gericault traveled to hospitals and morgues, and he did these intense studies of amputated limbs. I'm sorry if this is disturbing to you. He wanted to get a real sense of the kind of colorization and shape of dead flesh, of dead bodies. So like I said, he visited hospitals and morgues to understand the rot of the bodies. Now Gericault, Gericault was a kind of quiet guy, and he painted this to be displayed at the Grand Salon, and the idea being that everybody would see it. He painted this, but he didn't really want to explain it, because what he was talking about in this painting was a criticism of the king. Huh? What do you mean is a criticism of the king? Well, who put that incompetent captain in charge? The king did. So Gericault's Raft of the Medusa isn't just depicting this horrific event. He's making a statement about us, the people of France. Because just as the leader of the boat led to the horrific death of all of those innocent people, king, his incompetency, and we are those people of the Medusa. We are in trouble. He is our king, and he is incompetent, and we are doomed, just like the people on the Raft of the Medusa with that captain. So Gericault put up this, and he's like, check it out, and people are like, is that what you're trying to say? And he was like, what? He was hesitant, because if he were to openly criticize the king, he could get into a lot of trouble. But he was like, yeah, it is. He's also making another political statement here. Gericault was part of the abolitionist movement in France. The abolitionists at this time were arguing against French involvement in the African slave trade. And here he very consciously put the top, or the pinnacle of this pyramid of hope, he put a black man. He put this beautiful flesh of a black man. This is a sketch to show you his intention was to have an African man as the hero that rescues the Raft of Medusa survivors. Why? Because this is his argument. He is a man, just like you and me. He has every right to live, has every right to survive. He can be a hero just as much as another. So here we have this intense value of an African man, because Gericault is part of the abolitionist movement. He is a human. He wants to live. He wants to thrive. He wants to survive. Gericault. To give you a sense of, or give you context for the African slave trade in France. Here, this is showing you the West African slave regions, including regions in what was colonized by France, and the importation of slaves into North and South America, and the King of France being a benefit to this involvement. Wow. Gericault. Notice too in this composition, you see how he pushes us in two different ways? We see this pull up of the heroic moment. We see this desire to live, and then our eye pulls down to this despair. So our eye is literally forced or torn apart just as we stand in front of this, that sublime kind of fear and hope and awe. The line here is just tearing us apart. We feel so much. It's totally unlike neoclassicism, right? Neoclassicism was like, this is a story and this is how you should behave. Here, we're just overwhelmed by emotion.